The first technique that we're going to practice with watercolor is creating overlap with 3 colors. So creating overlap is definitely important. We're going to be working with really light layers for this. So I'm going to pick three different colors. I'm going to start with blue. Really any colors for this will work great because we are going to be using such a watered down wash of color that it's not going to really matter too much what colors you choose. So I'm starting by getting my water on my brush, and then I'm going over my blue here. And I'm gonna grab a little bit more water, make sure that it's nice and watered down. And then I'm going to just make a light mark underneath. So this is my first layer, which is the light blue. And I'm gonna make sure that that is really light. If you accidentally have too dark of a color and you can't see the white paper through it, just grab a little bit more water before it dries and paint right over it to lighten that color slightly. And I'll zoom in here. The second thing that I'm gonna do is grab another color. So I'm going to grab purple and do the same thing, just get a little bit of color on my paintbrush, dip it in the water so that I have a really light coat, and then I'm gonna paint it on top. So you should be layering this light enough where you can see the difference between what it looks like on just the white paper and then what it looks like where it overlaps with the blue. So I'm gonna bring that purple all the way across. And then I'm gonna go in with my third color. Now it definitely helps if you're waiting for your layers to dry in between. So maybe give it about 1 or 2 minutes in between each layer just to help with that overlap. And this is a great way for our project with this X-ray painting style to incorporate a little bit more of this overlap and working in layers. And then I'm gonna choose one more color. So I'm going to do a darker blue on top. So I'm getting a little bit more water on my brush, a little bit of the color, and then I'm gonna choose an area where I can overlap all sections. So I'm gonna start with my blue and layer that on top. So I'm gonna add a little bit more water to this since that was such a dark layer. And then let those sections dry. So now I have the 3 different areas of overlap. The next technique that we're gonna work with is called bleed 2 analogous colors together. So analogous colors are any 2 colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. They're probably going to be next to each other on your paint palette. So they're just similar colors, so when they mix and blend, the colors are going to look good together. So if I'm using a green and a red, for example, those colors are complementary, so they're not going to mix very well together. So colors more like red and orange, or orange and yellow, yellow and green, blue and purple. Those are analogous colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So I'm gonna start with putting water down in the background, and this is gonna help to bleed my colors together. So I'm just doing a light wash of water. And that way I don't have a harsh edge where one color stops and one color starts. So this is going to help to blend things together and bleed those colors. I'm gonna do a red first. So I'm grabbing a good amount of red here on my brush and adding it onto my paper. And then I'm going to use an orange. So I put my brush back in the water, grabbing a little bit more orange, and I'm going to bleed or mix those colors together, which is really just incorporating a good amount of water and allowing the color and the water to do the work. So just to mix those colors in between. So when this dries, it's going to create a nice blend of colors. And I also want to note that I am working with printer paper in the background here. So that does make our colors look a little bit different because the watercolor paper is going to be more of that white background where this is soaking up the water and not really giving us the colors that it's going to look like with the watercolor or the watercolor paper background. The next technique is pull in color, which is where we're gonna start with a darker brush stroke. So any color is fine. I'm gonna get a dark green here. And I'm not adding much water to this. So I'm just starting with a dark brush stroke here. And then you can give it a couple seconds to kind of dry a little bit. And then I'm gonna start to pull the color down using a wet paintbrush. So I'm just going to take this water and pull it down. So it's leaving more of that darker outline and just bringing down the color. So this is a nice technique to use in areas where you want a little bit more outline, but you still want that color to bleed and blend into the rest of the object. All right, moving on to our next technique. This is called lift color. This is a great technique to use in areas such as clouds, where you want more of the background to be a solid color, and then you're lifting out that color to create more of a white or lighter value. So I'm gonna do this as if it was a sky or clouds, and I'm going to start by first of all painting the background with just water. So super important with this technique to not let your watercolor dry before you lift it out. So I'm starting with plenty of water, adding my blue for the sky, and then I'll do another layer because I want to make sure we have plenty of paint. And then I'm going to grab a paper towel and kind of bunch it up a little bit here and let it soak for a second and then pull that up. Again, this is going to work a lot better when we start using watercolor paper. You're going to be able to see this technique a lot more. But you can start to see there are areas that are a little bit lighter that don't have the paint. And then the background is going to be darker where you still have that blue color. All right, so our next one here is texture with salt. This is a great technique to add a little bit of texture into your project, where it's going to just kind of take the background, the colors that you're working with, and add more of a speckled texture into it. So I'm gonna start out and make sure, just like with the last one, that my background has plenty of water. And then I'm gonna add some color into it. So I'm gonna do purple, making sure I have plenty of paint. And then I'm going to blend that into a blue. So if you wanna do all one color, that's fine. If you wanna blend a few colors, that's fine as well. And from here, I'm just gonna take some salt and drop it onto the watercolor. You can brush this off when you're finished, and it does take a minute to dry and kind of crystallize and soak up the water, but basically the salt is soaking up the water and it's going to create a little bit of texture onto your piece. So we'll give that a minute here to dry. So once your section has dried, you should be able to see a little bit of texture where everything isn't completely smooth, but you have more of that speckled texture on top of your practice. All right, so the next section, we're gonna do texture with Saran Wrap. So this is just another way of creating a layer of texture. Texture always adds nice interest into the piece that you're working with. For this one, I'm gonna start out the same way. Just do some water in the background because we wanna make sure that this does not dry before we're able to put the Saran Wrap down. And then I'm gonna layer at least 2 colors, so 2 to 3 colors. I'm gonna start with red in the background, and then I'll just layer an orange on top. So I'm gonna make sure I get plenty of paint on here. The past couple ones we've been doing a thin layer of paint, but for this one, definitely add a good amount to the bottom layer and then a good amount to the top layer as well. So getting an orange and adding this on top. All right, so I'm gonna take some Saran Wrap and kind of scrunch it up so you don't want it to be flat. The more scrunched up it is, the more detailed texture that will be added. So then I'm just gonna take it, press it down onto my paper, allow it to dry, and then when it does dry, which should take maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I'll come back and take this off for a texture. The next technique here is called wet on wet, and this is basically just to show the difference between what your brush strokes are gonna look like if your background of the paper is wet or if the background of the paper is dry, which is the next technique that we'll do after this one. So I'm gonna go ahead and add water to the background of my paper here. And then I'm gonna grab a color and just add it right on top of this. So you can see that it's going to be a lot more blended, especially if we're adding 2 or 3 colors into it. It's going to blend those together a lot easier than if you're using the wet on dry technique. However, the wet on dry technique will give you sharper edges to work with. So definitely something to consider. So that's the wet on wet, is if your background's wet. Wet on dry again is if your background is dry. So I'm gonna start with that background just being the white of the paper. And then I'm going to grab my color and add that here so you can see the edges are much sharper than the wet on wet. And then if we allow this to dry, when I add another color next to it, it's not going to bleed together as easily as the wet on wet. So think about with your project, which of these is going to be good in specific areas for the effect or the technique that you want for your project. Moving on to this next one, we're gonna do a paint splatter. Paint splatter, you're going to want to try to find a larger brush to work with if you have one. If not, a smaller brush should work just fine. I don't want too much water on it, otherwise it's going to be too diluted of drops. So I'm going to grab my color. I'm just going to use a purple again on here. Like I said, not have too much water on my brush. Then I'm going to hold it straight up and down, and with my thumb, I'm going to pull up from the bottom, aiming down at my paper, and it will create splatters onto it. So try this with a couple of colors to get used to the technique. It's something different, but it does create a really cool texture that could be added on top of specific areas of your project that you want to have just that extra layer to really stand out and have a nice splatter effect on it. The last technique here is called crayon resist. And this can be done a number of ways, but if you want to work with a white crayon, this usually is the best way to really have that specific area left as the white of the background and then the color on top. So if you want to use other colors other than a white crayon, this definitely works. I'm going to go ahead and use a gray crayon and just make a design on here. But try this with a white crayon as well. This would leave the background white and just create an interesting texture as you're adding your paint on top. So I have the gray added here, and then I'm gonna get my water. I'm gonna work with a yellow for this. So I'm gonna grab my yellow onto my paintbrush and then just paint right over top of this. So it's gonna make the area that I had colored in with the crayon stand out a little bit more. Or like I said, if I used white for this, it would leave that area white. So think about if there's areas on your project that you would maybe want to have more of the white of the paper there. So this wraps up the first practice. Definitely take your time with this, try out the techniques and think about which ones are going to apply the best for your final project. And then when you're ready, move on to the next set of watercolor techniques.